IJN Mikasa. Mikasa. Mufasa?
Mufasa. Ooh, it tingles me.
I'm surrounded by idiots.
No, Mikasa is a Japanese pre-Dreadnought Battleship, which I've already opened up a door that I have never opened before. And anytime I bring up something new on this channel, it's like Pandora's box. Except there's like 1,000 of those, and every time I open one, it's like, well, now you have to explain all of that. And I'm like, okay, I guess that's what we're doing today. But give me a second. Mikasa, Pre-Dreadnought Battleship, was constructed in the late 1890s and is an only child. She never had any sisters. She's named after Mount Mikasa, located in Nara, Japan, and served in the Imperial Japanese Navy during the Russo-Japanese War, as well as during World War I. And as a pre-Dreadnought battleship, she's, well, a bit more distinctive. See, the definition of pre-Dreadnought battleship is a little vague, but it basically refers to any battleship, which she is a battleship, but any of those that was built from the mid to late 1880s into the early 1900s, prior to HMS Dreadnought in 1906. HMS Dreadnought is arguably one of the most influential ships ever designed and launched, because basically everyone started copying her after she appeared, because she was technically superior than pretty much any other battleship prior to her. Back during the time that pre-dreads were a thing, they weren't called pre-dreads, because, well, how would they know? They were simply called battleships, or sometimes more rank-specific terms like first-class battleships. Regardless, they were replacements for the ironclads, which existed prior to them. A significant portion of the pre-dreads were heavily based on the Royal Navy's Majestic class, and they were constructed of steel, and driven by coal-fired boilers powering compound reciprocating steam engines that turned screws. They carried a main battery of large guns, which rotated on mounts that were fully or partially armored, and pre-dreads generally had one or more secondary batteries of lighter weapons on their broadsides. Pre-dreads are kind of fun to talk about, because once the navies of the world figured out they could do better than the ironclads, it sort of went a little bit nuts, because a lot of the pre-dreads get really weird. Like, French pre-dreads are insane, because while everyone knew kinda what they were trying to do, they weren't really sure how to best go about that. In any event, Mikasa was a pre-dread. Laid down on January 24th, 1899, launched November 8th, 1900, and commissioned March 2nd, 1902. Mikasa was meant to be a more modernized ship for the Japanese Navy. But back in those days, Japan lacked both the technology and the capability to construct their own battleships. So they turned to the best place they thought they could go, the UK. Indeed, Mikasa was not built by Japan, she was built for Japan by the United Kingdom. She was ordered from the Vickers shipyard in Barrow-in-Furness in 1898 at the cost of £880,000. That was 8.8 million yen at the time. She didn't differ too much from the other ships that were ordered as part of the program, but she was unique enough to be her own thing. Again, she had no sisters at all. And her design was, in effect, a modified version of the Royal Navy's Formidable class. But Mikasa had two additional 6-inch guns. She had an overall length of 432 feet, a beam of 76 feet, a draft of 27 feet 2 inches, and she displaced 15,140 long tons at normal load. Her crew consisted of 830 officers and enlisted men, and if you're hearing all that and saying, she doesn't sound that big, and no, she wasn't. Battleships back then weren't ginormous, not nearly as big as they would get. Mikasa is not a small ship, but definitely not one you'd call huge. But she was still a warship, still a battleship, and had teeth to go along with her. Her main battery consisted of 4 Ellswick Ordnance Company 40 caliber 12-inch guns, mounted in twin-gun barbettes fore and aft of her superstructure, which were protected by armored hoods, meaning that they resembled gun turrets without actually being gun turrets. They weren't, but they looked like it. Their secondary armament consisted of 14 40 caliber 6-inch quick-firing guns, mounted in casemates. 10 of those were positioned on the main deck, and the other 4 were placed above them at the corners of her superstructure. She also had 20 12-pounder guns, as well as 8 3-pounder Hotchkiss guns, and 8 47mm 2.5-pounder Hotchkiss guns. And on top of all that, she was equipped with 4 submerged 18-inch torpedo tubes, 2 on each broadside. That layout is very pre-dread, particularly the 4 torpedo tubes. That's a little insane, but pre-dreads do get a little wacky at times, and honestly, even on that scale, Mikasa was relatively in line with what was considered normal. She was also powered by 2 vertical triple expansion steam engines, each one driving a single propeller. Those engines were provided their steam by 25 Belleville boilers, and her engines were rated at 15,000 indicated horsepower, pushing her to a top speed of 18 knots. At least, her designed speed. As it turned out, she was actually a bit faster than they expected, approaching 19 knots, a little less. But they weren't exactly complaining about that, that was good. And she had a range of 9,000 nautical miles. Her armor belt consisted of Krupp cemented armor, which is a type of steel naval armor used in the construction of capital ships. It was developed by Germany's Krupp Arms Works in 1893. It was proven to be more effective than the armor they had been using, and she had 9 inches of that stuff over her midsection, but it was only 4 inches around the bow and the stern. Additionally, she was fitted with 4 bar and Stroud FA-3 coincidence rangefinders, which had an effective range of 7,300 meters, 8,000 yards. And she had 24-power magnification telescopic gun sights. Radar wasn't a thing back then, so yeah, that's how they did it. And those tools were in line with the standard of the IJN at the time. All the other Japanese battleships had that as well. She would be sponsored by Baroness Hayashi. She would later be a countess. She launched Mikasa on November 8th, 1900, and after she was completed, she left the UK and headed to Yokohama, under the command of Captain Hayasaki. The first year or 2 of her career was largely unnotable, but it was a good thing the Japanese had upgraded their fleet because they got into it with the Russians. The Russo-Japanese War, which lasted from February 8, 1904 to September 5, 1905, was fought between those 2 nations mostly over rival imperial ambitions in Manchuria and the Korean Empire. It was a relatively brief but pretty brutal conflict, started by Japan after peaceful negotiations broke down in a surprise attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur on February 9th of 1904. Wait, they started things with them with a surprise attack on their Pacific Fleet, did they? Interesting. I'm just gonna let that be. Both sides would declare war, and by the end of things, about 100,000 people were dead, so it was not a good time for anybody in that vicinity of the world. But one thing it did show the world at large is that when it came to naval conflict, Japan was not playing. Russia went in with a lot of confidence. They had a pretty modern fleet as well, but Japan showed that they knew what they were doing, and Mikasa was a big part of that. During the war, she was commanded by Captain Hikojiro Aijichi, and would be assigned to the 1st Division of the 1st Fleet. She was Japan's golden child, and her first taste of war happened when she participated in the Battle of Port Arthur on February 9th, 1904. Admiral Togo Hayachiro led the 1st Fleet in an attack on the Russian ships of the Pacific Squadron, which were anchored just outside of the port. This was that surprise attack I mentioned earlier, just to be clear. The difference between this and, say, Pearl Harbor is that this surprise didn't really turn out to be a surprise. The Russians wound up detecting them. The Japanese had expected the Russians to be taken off guard and therefore disorganized. But the Japanese fleet had been spotted by the Russian cruiser, Boyarin, and she would let the Russians know that the Japanese were coming. Togo proceeded to attack anyway, though another mistake he made in this situation was that he opted to attack the Russian coastal defenses with the main armament of the ships, and engage the Russian ships with secondary guns. Now, the problem with that is, basically, the secondary guns were doing nothing to the Russian ships. They were pre-dreads too, and fairly modern, and could deal with that. A significant portion of the ships on both sides would be struck, but this particular attack was not really that successful in the grand scheme of things. Russian casualties numbered only 17, and the Japanese suffered 60 killed and wounded, before Togo opted to disengage, realizing that this attack was not going according to plan whatsoever. Mikasa herself was hit by two 10-inch shells, which did relatively little damage all things considered, though it did wound 7 of her crew. Despite this earlier blunder, Togo wasn't bad at his job. He was smart, and would swiftly turn things around for Japan as the war dragged on. Mikasa was once again involved in an action on April 13th, when Togo managed to lure out a significant portion of the Russian Pacific Squadron, which included the flagship of Vice Admiral Stepan Makarov, Petropavlovsk. Now, Makarov wasn't a complete idiot either. Though he fell for the lure, he knew he probably shouldn't engage the Japanese in the situation he had found himself in. When he spotted the Japanese, who had 5 battleships, he immediately ordered a swift turnaround, heading back for Port Arthur. The problem was, the Japanese had laid mines the previous night, and that was a big part of Togo's plan. He didn't expect the Russians to engage them. He just wanted to lure them into the mines. And indeed, Petropavlovsk did strike a mine, which caused one of her magazines to explode, bringing her down in less than 2 minutes and killing 677 men, including Makarov himself. Togo would then proceed to order multiple long-range bombardment missions on the area, which prompted the Russians to start laying many more of their own minefield, which did have some limited success in sinking 2 Japanese battleships, so that wasn't Mikasa. She was fine. She was not fine on August 10th, during the Battle of the Yellow Sea. Mikasa, as the lead ship, was at the head of the column, and therefore was a primary target for the Russians. She absorbed 20 hits. 2 of those knocked out her aft 12-inch gun turret, and she suffered 125 casualties on board. She did fire back at battleships Poltava and Cesarevich, but didn't do very much damage to either. But she would survive the battle, and where she, and the rest of the Japanese Navy to be honest, really shined was at the Battle of Tsushima, which took place on May 27, 1905. Mikasa was once again at the lead of the First Fleet, and their opponents were the 2nd and 3rd Pacific Squadrons detached from the Baltic Fleet of Russia. This would be the final naval battle of the Russo-Japanese War, and while it is a pretty complicated topic in and of itself, what you need to know is that the Russians lost really badly, honestly. Mikasa started things off by opening fire at the battleship Knyaz Suvorov, which was the Russian flagship, at 14:10. She was joined in this particular engagement by battleship Asahi and the armored cruiser Azuma, and they kept firing for about an hour, which caused significant damage to Suvorov. The Japanese had managed to start a fire on board the Russian flagship and badly wounded the fleet commander, Vice Admiral Zinovy Rozhesvensky. Suvorov also lost the use of her rear 12-inch gun turret, and her steering was jammed so she couldn't stay in formation. Mikasa wasn't just dealing damage though, because she was also prime target and the Russians were shooting back. She actually took a lot of hits, at least 6 12-inch shots and 19 6-inch shots, but they didn't actually do very much damage to her, striking her in heavily armored sections of her build. Togo was able to maneuver his fleet and cross the T, allowing him to fire with full broadsides from his ships. The Russians were able to get Suvorov back into the fight by fixing the steering, but her movements were pretty erratic and she often blundered in between lines of fire, blocking her own allies from shooting back at the Japanese. Mikasa would also fire on the battleship Borodino, which was sunk, but probably not by her. It's believed that Fuji, another pre-Dreadnought, fired the shot that caused Borodino's magazine to explode. Which, yeah, she sunk from that. That wasn't good. And Mikasa did run into some blunders during the battle too. At 1804, one of her 12-inch shells detonated in the barrel, which disabled the gun and knocked out the left gun until 1840. that wasn't even the first time that it happened during the battle. It's just the first time it happened, it hadn't damaged the gun somehow. One of her 6-inch guns also jammed after firing 19 rounds, and another one of her 6-inch guns would be disabled by a Russian shell. In total, she fired 124 12-inch shells during the battle, which placed her in second for the amount of shells fired during the battle, behind only one of her cousins, Asahi. She absorbed more than 40 hits, and did suffer 113 personnel casualties, but in terms of seaworthiness, Mikasa took it like a champ. She was relatively intact, and as I mentioned, that battle was a decisive victory for the Japanese. In total, they would only have 117 dead and 583 injured, as well as losing 3 torpedo boats. But the Russian side was not at all the same situation. Among their sailors, 5,045 were dead and 803 were injured. 6,016 were captured, 6 of their battleships were sunk, 1 coastal battleship was sunk, 14 other ships were sunk, 2 of their battleships were captured, 2 coastal battleships captured, 1 destroyer was captured, and 6 more ships were disarmed. It was a disaster for the Russians. And just a few months later, both sides would sign the Treaty of Portsmouth, bringing an end to the war. On September 5th, 1905, and just 6 days after the treaty was signed, Mikasa blew up. Yeah, what? Wait, the war's over? Why are you blowing up now? What happened? Well, what happened was a fire on board that happened to get to one of her magazines, and yeah, that blew her up on the night of the 11th and into the 12th of September, killing 251 of her crew. Seriously, the war just ended. Why are you like this? She would sink as a result of that, but she was refloated on August 7th, 1906, and repaired, believe it or not, at Sasebo Naval Arsenal. She was even given a bunch of upgrades, including more powerful 45 caliber 12-inch and 6-inch guns. I figured they might as well because it took 2 years to put her back together. A lot of other navies would have probably scrapped her, but Japan always respected the Mikasa. They were pretty proud of their victory in the war, and she had been the lead ship, their flagship, so they didn't want to just give up on her because of a stupid accident. She re-entered active service on August 24th, 1908, but she almost blew up again in 1912. This time it was the result of a sailor who was really trying to off himself. Yeah, seriously, and I guess he decided to take the entire ship with him, which seems like a bit of a... Look. You shouldn't be doing that activity. I'm sure you know what we're talking about. Can't say the word because YouTube doesn't like words. But if you're gonna do that, and you shouldn't, but if you're going to, don't try to take a bunch of other people with you. That's like a, we call that murder. We don't do that. But yeah, he tried to blow her up while she was at anchor near Kobe, but fortunately he was stopped. And during World War I, she didn't do a whole heck of a lot. She pretty much just did coastal defense duties, making sure nobody came close to Japan during that time. But the only time she was truly at war was during the Japanese intervention in Siberia during the Russian Civil War in 1921. Granted, she didn't do much there either, and would be later reclassified on September 1st, 1921 as a first-class coast defense ship rather than a battleship. And it is important to mention it is the 1920s. She's a pre-dreadnought. She's been obsolete for multiple years. The Japanese had already upgraded to have actual dreadnoughts, and Mikasa was very much nearing the end of her days, at least that's what you'd think. But Japan had a soft spot for her, like I said. During her career, though, she did have one more incident where she ran aground off the coast of Vladivostok on September 17th of 1921. But that didn't seriously damage her, so it wasn't really a major deal, just one of those things. In any event, she would finally be decommissioned on September 23rd, 1923, due to the fact that she was obsolete, as well as the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, and Mikasa was considered unnecessary in the modern day. She would be no match for modern dreadnoughts, and she was scheduled for scrapping. But the Japanese, again, loved that ship, and their government approached the other signatory countries of the treaty, and asked for special permission that would allow them to preserve Mikasa as a memorial ship. The plan was to encase her in concrete. She wouldn't even be in the water anymore, and she would be completely disarmed with her engines removed. The other countries involved saw no problem with this because, first of all, she was a completely obsolete pre-dread, and if she would be disarmed and encased in concrete, I mean, she was not going to be able to do much in a war situation anyway. So yes, they said okay. They allowed Japan an exception so they could preserve Mikasa. True to their word, all of her engines and guns were removed. The guns being replaced with replicas, but not ones that are capable of firing in any capacity. And she would be open for display on November 12, 1926 in Yokosuka, in the presence of Admiral Togo Haihachiro himself, as well as the then Crown Prince Hirohito. And she sat there for many years as a preserved pre-dread. The only preserved pre-dread, I should probably mention. But then Japan got just a little carried away with the whole imperialism thing and decided they were going to try to touch another nation's boats. And this time they were ours. And we didn't like that. As World War II dragged on and we started making regular bombing runs of the home islands, Mikasa would be pretty badly damaged by US bombers. Not really on purpose, since she wasn't exactly a valid target. We were just dropping bombs and she was there. It's a thing that occurs. And when Japan did surrender in 1945, she fell under the control of occupation forces. And in this context, that means mostly us, as well as some support from our allies. With the war over, American troops would remove her superstructure and decide to put a Quonset hut on her deck, turning her remains into an aquarium and what was called Club Mikasa, a nightclub for American servicemen. I'm sorry. I need to stop the story. Can we talk about the level of disrespect here? You guys flew over the Pacific and bombed the crap out of our boats. So in return, not only do we just evaporate the entirety of your navy, but we go to your only preserved pre-Dreadnought, a memorial to those lost in the Russo-Japanese War, cherished icon of your nation. And after, not even on purpose, bombing her, we turn her into an aquarium and a club for our soldiers. Yo! Absolute brutality. But seriously, you started it. I don't know what you expected. Granted, she did not remain a nightclub nor an aquarium. That was eventually resolved. As the rebuilding of Japan continued, and existing tensions softened between the two nations, evolving into an alliance that stands today, both the Japanese, as well as the Americans still there, would restore Mikasa. They were able to retrieve some of the removed superstructure which had not been scrapped, though they did have to replace many components, which were taken from a decommissioned Chilean dreadnought named Almirante Latorre. There's also belief that they may have taken some parts from another dreadnought from Argentina, ARA Moreno, but that's unconfirmed. This restoration campaign was championed by two people. In 1955, an American businessman named John Rubin wrote a letter to Japan Times about the state of Mikasa because, well, she'd been left as just a club and an aquarium and looked kind of gross. And frankly, he felt that she should be restored. After all, they were rebuilding Japan. Shouldn't an icon of their history be also carried forward? The Japan Times agreed with the sentiment, and the Japanese public also got on board, and the process was pushed forward by Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz himself. Yes! One of those instrumentally responsible for defeating Japan in World War II, said, you know, we really should restore that ship, and that's an incredibly honorable thing for him to do. The process took several years, but she was restored and reopened in 1961, and she has been there ever since. Interestingly, on August 5th, 2009, she was repainted by sailors from America, from USS Nimitz. Yes, really. We were like, oh, she needs a new paint job. We'll help you guys out. Like, honestly, after the whole World War II thing, Japan and America generally get along really well. You know, things are okay. That's always nice to see. And Mikasa's preservation is also helped by the fact that she's not actually in the ocean anymore. As I mentioned, they put her in concrete. She's in the ground. Just sitting there. Chilling. She'll never sail again, for obvious reasons. Even if we broke her out of there, what's underneath the concrete has deteriorated so much that there's just no way she'd ever be able to float. But she is still intact, as far as the eye can see. And as a result, she is the only preserved pre-Dreadnought battleship in the world. Not only that, she's also the only preserved battleship that isn't in America, because no one else saved theirs. And she's the last surviving example of a British-built battleship because, well, she wasn't built in Japan. She was built by the British. And because the only other battleships on the planet are all American, and we built all of ours ourselves, doing the math here, you can realize, oh, there aren't any other British battleships left. And yes, Mikasa's the only one of several categories, and will likely remain so. She stands as a symbol of pride to the people of Japan, and is a big part of their history. So she's likely to remain for many years to come, sitting in the same spot she has been since the 1920s, in concrete. Yeah, she's not going to move again. And that does raise the question, why don't we do that with every preserved ship? I mean, one of the big problems with preserving large ships is that the water degrades them, and yes, it does, but you have to consider a couple things. First of all, Mikasa is not a very large ship compared to others. She's not small, but she's not huge like, say, the Iowa classes, for example. So, putting concrete around her isn't as big a deal, A, because you don't need as much concrete to do it, and B, ships aren't necessarily designed to be out of the water. The physics get all screwy whenever you put them on land, which is why permanent dry dock for museum ships is usually not considered a good idea. And the larger a ship gets, the more that becomes a problem, and really Mikasa probably is the only ship that's ever going to get away with this, or perhaps a smaller one than her, but anything bigger, I wouldn't do that. And they haven't. They leave them in the water, where they're supposed to be. And by that I mean really only in America, because we're the ones who save their battleships, because you'll never take our ships from us! Japan tried it, and look what happened! This is the only one you have left now! And why? Why? Because you touched ours! If you want to touch someone else's boats, don't bother Russia! Don't you dare come over here again! Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.